much, Taiaiake. We have microphones and we'll take some questions from the floor. One thing I forgot to say in introducing him is that Taiaiake Alfred has a website, and on that, in a sense, modernity gives us the chance to return to some form of orality, in that he has videos of his some other talks he's given, including the NARM oration at the University of Melbourne in Australia, talking about Indigenous issues in that country, which is part of the Commonwealth, part of the former British Empire. And I recommend that. He also has an interview with Alan Gregg from TVO on his website. So he's generous in inviting you all to raise your questions related to what he has brought to us.
Start, Joe. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is part of the 12th annual Ottawa Peace Festival, and it's a fitting piece to that piece. We started talking about cultures of nonviolence and non-killing, cultures of peace, when we started this in the depths of the Afghanistan war. But what we weren't aware of at the time, and it's only now that we're really becoming aware that this is part of a 7,000-year-old or more history with the Creator's first peace pipe down near the river. And we didn't know about the peace tree that was passed to Hiawatha, which was near where the Museum of History was perhaps 1,000 years ago. So we didn't know that we were part of a long, long history, just participating in its own resurgence here. Let me move to my question, which is, aren't we asking something much more profound now in the face of environmental collapse than what was happening with Gandhi 70 or 80 years ago? Because the animals are dying, the oceans are sick and depopulated. The necessity of a connection with all my relations is more profound and necessary than sort of changing of colonial hats. So I'd like you to reflect on that.
Well, thanks for the question. I think the challenge for our time, I definitely agree with you, is to understand achievements of social justice and political justice in the context of the global environmental crisis. Right? It definitely brings a whole level of threat to our existence that maybe our ancestors didn't have to contend with, or didn't understand. I think that when we think about the teachings that are offered in our tradition, I don't know enough about the Gandhian tradition and the religious background and philosophical teachings to speak about that. Maybe somebody else could, but definitely in the Ongwahue tradition, the Guyana is one element of, and it's a reflection of, a worldview that, if you look at it in its entirety, is capable of reorienting our understanding of what our responsibilities are as humans in relation to the earth. So the Guyana I've spoken of today somewhat as in the way that I have, but that's in the context of other fundamental teachings. I always refer to the other very important aspect of Haudenosaunee culture, which is practiced daily by many people, which is the Ohandagari Wadeko, and the words that come before all else in our Thanksgiving address, which really helps people to understand the worldview that places us in a set and a web of relationships and really creates a framework for political decision-making that blocks off any movement towards the type of economic and political decisions that have created the crisis that we have all inherited. So the Ahandagari Wadekwa is the words that come before all else, the Thanksgiving address, is a recitation. It's a somewhat of a ceremony. Some people call it a prayer, but it's really a reminder, an expression of gratitude that places human beings in this web of relationship and is an expression and an acknowledgement of the sacredness of those relationships to maintaining a healthy balance in our lives and in the world. And Indigenous cultures all over the world have similar expressions of that. And I think that what we have moved away from, that has created this crisis, in moving away from the land and creating an industrialized society that is able, that creates a reality for people where their lives are disassociated from the processes of nature, from interactions with nature, is that we have a mentality emerging in our society which rationalizes decisions based on other framings of responsibility than the fundamental one. And I think that environmentalists, deep environmentalists, the environmental movement now, and growing in the larger consciousness in our society, is the flawed logic in liberal thinking, in capitalism, and in industrial society, generally speaking, whether it's capitalist or not. In that there has to be a return to an acknowledgement of the fundamental relationship between humans and the natural world, and a recovery of somewhat of a regime that respects that relationship. And that's something I think that is probably equal to or more, as you're asserting, in importance than the social and political problems that we're facing here. It depends. I haven't personally decided like what's more important, justice for our people and the suffering of our children, or reorienting our political structure so that decisions are made with respect to 7 generations and environmental consciousness. So this is a really big debate in all communities that are suffering from poverty and deprivation. And I don't even know if it's resolvable so much as to say we really need to do both. And a political movement and a political philosophy that can do both is possible, what I'm asserting, if we root ourselves in teachings and understandings like the ones that we're talking about, as opposed to theories and ideas and values that came from liberal thinkers in Europe who had no interest in preserving either our people or the land, who wanted to exploit both to enrich themselves so that they can enjoy lives of opulence and oppress others because that was what they believed to be their entitlement. Our whole world is running on principles derived from those men. And we need to reject those principles and develop principles based on other teachings. I think that's the large project that we're encountering as a society right now.
Want to go up there? Or
I can restate your question if people can't hear it.
Okay. From what you're saying, like I understand what you're saying about these two things, the social issues or the political issues, and trying to organize those.
Mm-hmm.
So you must have read the Reconciliation Manifesto.
Yes.
Yeah. So in there, what my question is how do, as governments, we reconcile the relationships to our lands?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question.
Okay. Did everyone hear? No? Okay, I'll try to restate. So her question was, as governments, as Indigenous governments?
Both.
as governments, how do we reconcile our relationship to the land? And that question was asked in the context of the larger issue out there of the Truth and Reconciliation's recommendations and 94 recommendations and so forth.
Pipelines. And
Yeah, everything going on. How do we reconcile our relationship to the land? Another amazingly hard question, but I think you're asking kind of a similar question, and the idea, like as I'm
well,
here,
he's coming from environment and trying to save the environment and the health of our land.
Mhm.
But you can't save that until you have that relationship established,
Mhm.
either through governments on both sides.
Mhm.
Yeah. So-
Okay, thanks for that. I get your question, even clarity now. How do we reconcile the relationship of our government so that we can take action effectively? That's kind of what I'm hearing. And so, yeah, I would say my answer to that and my thinking on that is that means that even if we're pushing on environmental issues and moving to defend the earth and the principles and so forth, we also have to continue and almost redouble our efforts at political decolonization and the creation of a set of just relationships between nations in this country. Because colonialism and the system of government that we have today is designed for exploitation. So Canada today, however people who are progressive-minded citizens today don't want to acknowledge it or want to distance themselves from the reality, was created to exploit the land with no thought as to the future, and was created to exploit the people with no thought to their future or anything like that too. And so we've inherited that system, and there's a legacy of that built into all of these relationships. And I think that unfortunately that even extends to Indigenous governance, because most of our Indigenous governments are Indian Act extensions of that Canadian political authority into our communities. My basic answer is we need to restore traditional Indigenous governance, and we need to enliven that with our political movement and our intellectual work, and we need to restore the power of those as representative of our people and the land. And so I think if Canadians truly believe in reconciliation, they will acknowledge the fact of the damage that Canadian, not only individual priests and so forth have done in residential schools, but also the harm of the system and what it allows to happen on the land. And that we need a reorientation of governance in this country that brings forward these teachings and puts them forward as governing principles over territory. And that can only happen when we restore our traditional governments, their chiefs and matriarchies and so forth over the land, and when we begin to defend those with our actions and in our words. So reconciling government is basically, to me, restoring traditional governments and negotiating respect for that within the Canadian context. I'm kind of a traditionalist when it comes to government. That's the goal. In the meantime, I think there's a lot of things that governments can do with good-minded people who want to undermine the negative effect of those policies and laws and programs that are in place today. But that's a stopgap measure to a fundamental reorientation by restoration of traditional government.
I'm only going to speak at a turn because that's my mother. And I stood up in the back hoping to get to the mic before, and I see people, so I hope I don't create a chain reaction of speaking at a turn. But I wanted to just kind of share my reaction to how you toned reconciliation. And for me, reconciliation has been the door that provided me the resurgence as an Indigenous person in this country. The TRC's opening events, I worked there, and the work that Murray Sinclair and the work that Wilton Littlechild is doing with the 94 calls to action at the TRC, I feel as though I'm just reacting in the sense that if you tone it in a way where it's complacent, I feel as though that also undermines all that work. Because with the orange shirts in the audience, that's a form of reconciliation, at the same time resurgence. So I think I just wanted to share my reaction and maybe see what your response is in the sense of that tone of reconciliation, because reconciliation, if we keep moving the bar, okay, reconciliation is complacent, that's not the solution, and we keep moving the bar to something else, we're never really gonna reach a place where we can actually do a full pull-up, you know? So I guess my response is that way, and just trying to see what your response is.
All right, no, thanks for that, bro. Appreciate that. I appreciate what you said too about the tone and the aspect of it too, because in my logic and what I'm trying to say, I'm not meaning to disrespect the work that's been put into all of this. I have a lot of respect for Senator Sinclair and Wilton and the work they've done over the years. The tone of it as complacency, yeah, I would take that back. I'm not meaning to say that the work that they did is an act of complacency. More, my tone of that it was directed at was Canadians who accept that as the end rather than the beginning. So, just to clarify, thank you for giving me an opportunity to do that. If people think that the work that they've put into it and all the pain that people have shared and the learnings that have happened and the activism that's come out of it and the activation of Indigenous identities that has come out of that is enough. That's what I meant to say, that's complacent. I totally agree with you, it's an entree. That's kind of what I meant by drawing out, like, is it a mistake to think or is it just an agenda? Okay, so I could use a better framing. Yeah. Is it an entree or is it the end? Maybe I'll use that next time.
Resurgence.
So
You gotta
thanks.
be on resurgence, my man.
All right, all right, man. And I love the metaphor of the pull-up. Awesome.
Sego. I'm wondering how you referenced in the days of your thinking around peace, power, and righteousness when you were writing that around co-optation. And so that made me think a lot of, should we be challenging the system or can we work within the system?
Oh my God.
Okay, so you have many Onwe here, including myself, who are working within the colonial structure. We are aware that we are working within the colonial structure. AFN, universities, Government of Canada. Can we make change from within the system? What is our role from within the system? Are we co-opted? Sure we are, but is there still something that we can do to shift and to move towards where we want to get to?
No. That question. It's the one that really has been dogging me my whole career, and I think anybody who works in politics, So I literally remember the first class I taught at Concordia University in 1993. It was a grad seminar on Native politics. The first argument I had was over, can you change within the system or not? And we're still talking about it because I think it's going to be an ever-present reality. It's going to be an ever-present challenge to those of us that engage in that system. I would put myself in the same boat as you. I'm working in a university. That's as colonial a place as you can get on most days. I engage in politics. I work with tribal governments on the US side. I work with band governments here. So I don't mean to distinguish what I'm saying from any reality that anybody who works in colonial institutions work. So by virtue, I'd say, my answer to the question, by virtue of my own experience, I'd have to say, I agree that you can make some change by engaging with that system. But I think the tone, back to tone, the tone of a lot of people is not yours, but the tone of a lot of people when they ask that question is, well, why aren't you working, why aren't you running for election? Why don't you want to be the prime minister? Or why don't you want to work as a city councilor or something like that? And that's different degree, I think, of integration in the system. And all this to say, I think it's a kind of an artful response that we have to have. And one that's predicated on our own rootedness, in our own culture, in our own traditions. So just to illustrate, I think there's a big difference between someone who is rooted in their culture, their language, their community, who understands it, who maintains active accountabilities, and then engages in that system. That's different than somebody who doesn't have those things and comes into that system much more liable to get taken up and used in that system as a weapon against. And that happens on a lot of different levels, right? So it happens at the university as well. There's a lot of different ways in which a person can get used when they have blind spots, either because of their lack of cultural knowledge, because of their masculinity, and being raised in a certain masculine culture and not understanding the suffering and traumas of people in Indigenous communities, women and Two-Spirit people who have come into these spaces and reacting in a way and teaching in a way that further traumatizes people, not out of intention, but out of blind spotting. So being blind spotted to that means, what's your responsibility? If you want to keep engaging in that space, you need to learn. You need to acknowledge, you need to learn, you need to develop strength to be able to continue to engage in an effective way in that scenario. And I think that that's just as true for me as you. I don't even really know your background or anything, but for you and anybody else who's doing that, the continual process of learning about what we don't know, and the continual process of being accountable and developing accountability structures enables us to continue to move forward and be effective in those spaces. I think the minute that we run away from accountability, and the minute that we think that we know everything and we know enough to be effective agents of change in that system, is when we start being co-opted. Okay, so co-optation happens when you have the hubris to think that I don't have anything more to learn. I'm a representative of Ungwehume. And so many people fall into that trap. You know, men, women, whatever. They fall into the trap of thinking that they can speak for. And they don't know that you have to go back and look at the people in the eye and get turned around and bundled up and then sent back as a representative. They don't understand that. And I think that's a big problem. And when people in that scenario talk about working within the institution, I think that we run into problems. And it's not an unresolvable problem, but it's something where we need to put work into creating more of a, I hesitate to use the word accountability, that sounds legalistic, but more of a relationship. And giving people pathways and making it possible for them to maintain the relationships that they have in their community so that they can continue to engage. Like, I know a lot of people who have a lot of great effect in government, in van government, in tribal government, in universities, who are people who embody and who maintain their connection, and then also know the opposite. So to me, it's a matter of that, as opposed to a clear-cut question, which I used to think. You know, I remember used to teaching our students, you can't change from within the system. It's a sellout to go work for the government. And well, you know, part of this resurgence is moving away from that kind of battle-oriented, hard-line mentality to one that is more reflective of people's realities and more based on spiritual power, as opposed to other forms of contention.
As a non-Indigenous person working in government only for a short time, and I can't say where, for obvious reasons, but yeah, I mean, getting back to those core principles of rooting in your true self. As Indigenous people are coming into government agencies, I've been inside and out for a long time, but I've seen a change in culture that, over the last 10 years maybe, where there's been a bit of a colonization of our institutions. I mean, there has anyways, but in the culture in our institutions, and in some institutions, people are less connected to themselves. We're connecting with each other less, we're sharing ideas less, and there's a lot less love than there used to be. And at the risk of stereotyping, there's so much that Canadians have to learn from Indigenous culture, which is obvious. But I'm stating the obvious because in our government institutions, as Indigenous brothers and sisters are coming in, you have this immense power to help us reconnect, help us awaken in so many different ways, but help our cultures change. And that's a richness that's always been there, and it's just waiting to happen. And your presence is incredibly important and powerful, even if it's just a few people at this moment in time. It is making a difference, and there is a power there. And please take that power, and please influence institutions. I don't know where it will go. Maybe it won't go anywhere, but I don't believe that it won't go anywhere. But to help us to help us decolonize our thinking, to help us decolonize our spirits and reconnect with love and that rootedness, it's very much possible. So please consider that.
All right, now,
I had a question. You can't pronounce the fundamental law of Minnesota, but UNDRIP seems like a really good development, United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. How does that sit? I assume it was developed with Indigenous people around the world. Does it sit well with the Haudenosaunee?
good. Thanks for the question. That's another point of contention, debate. The development of the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration, was decades in coming. And there's people from the Haudenosaunee that were very central to that. Have to give credit to Kenneth Deere from Kahnawake, who was chair of the Indigenous Peoples Forum for many years and was very influential in that. There's many legal scholars from Canada. I mentioned Wilton Littlechild. He was important in that as well, in developing it, and people from all over the world. The politics around it, of course, kind of tainted the experience towards the end, because the way the United Nations system works is levels of approval and so forth up to the final stamp of approval from the General Assembly. The vision that the Indigenous Working Group put forward originally got gradually changed. So what we see now in the UNDRIP is something that can be generally acceptable to everyone. And there was much negotiation around the provisions around what are the rights of the Indigenous people to their land. That was the fundamental one. And also in determining and relationship of their government, their autonomous status in relation to the countries in which they live in, so to speak. And so those two fundamental issues were issues that got debated and challenged and so forth. And I'd say from the perspective of most Indigenous, there's Umwahumi in the room and they can express their own personal opinion, but I think if you're asking me to kind of reflect a general sense of it, the UNDRIP is seen as a positive statement, but not nearly reflective of the full expression of our rights as we see them. And so it's another one of those things, it's kind of like reconciliation. It's a starting point, but it's not a full representation of what we see as a just relationship between our people and Canada. And add to that, I think the fact that it was as all of these declarations are in the UN system, they're not binding on the part of the United States and Canada. So the United States and Canada only accept them if they choose to, and they can accept them with reservations, and which both countries have. And so they get to interpret what it means. So in every university and in every kind of act of reconciliation we see with respect to and honoring the United Nations Declaration and so forth, well, that's okay, but it's up to interpretation. It's not clear cut as to what that actually means. And so it's another kind of opportunity to debate. And I take the point of the young brother here is that there are opportunities presented through these things to have debates that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so if you're comfortable with incrementalism, then it's seen to be progress and towards this objective of justice. It's open to criticism, but taking the point that he made, yeah, it's an opportunity. I know a lot of people that were involved in that process for many years that were very frustrated at the end. But in the end, we have to give credit to everybody that was there and the process, because everybody did agree. There's nobody who disavowed and disowned that document or the process. Everybody went along with it grudgingly as they would, but that's politics. And politics is a game of compromise, and so inherently in that UN system it was going to be a compromise. Yeah.
There is actually one question on that side, and I think that gentleman has been waiting for a while
I'm sorry.
now to ask the
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
And I think we'll have to end it with yours afterwards, Manvita, because
Thank you for a great analysis of spirituality, materialism.
Don't think we can hear you.
There is no possibility of resurrection without a crucifixion. So we must recognize that this crisis is actually an opportunity for all of us to grow spiritually. And I think in the case of India, if Britain had taken along with the crown jewels just a sliver of India's spirituality, we would have a completely different world today. But nonetheless, I think we thank the British for actually bringing us into a place where we can explore who we are. And what I have understood from my studying with the Guru in India is that in our intellect, there are three states from which we operate. There is the state of somebodiness. I'm a somebody, I'm an engineer, I am a Canadian, I am a religious person, etc., etc. That's a somebodiness. Then we go through a crisis which blows all of these labels out of this planet, and we become a nobody. And we have the opportunity to either move back into the somebody state, or we move into the everybody state. And I have a sense that you have actually moved into the everybody state when you mentioned the word inclusion, which is great. This is where we all want to be, inclusion. Now the question is that I ask you, why can't we require all those CEOs that are presently negotiating pipelines, exploration of their resources, to spend 1 year on a reserve to absorb the native culture? Because when a person begins to see the street not just as a commodity to be cut and turned into lumber, but as part of his or her own lungs, then they will have a greater respect for that tree. You can't tell these people that they are extension of nature because this is just theoretical. But when they experience it, you have an opportunity to change this world. And so I ask you, are the First Nations ready to accept members of, let's say, anybody who wants to go into the civil service, to the work in the government, must spend 1 whole year on a reserve. and simply actually absorbing the perspective of the native.
I would say, based on historical experience, yes, Native people have always been welcoming and to a fault, are generous with their time and their resources and so forth. I get the point you're making, and I actually think it's an amazing 95th recommendation from the TRC. So there was 94, let's add one that says let the Canadian government provide resources and funding and support for Canadians who want to come and learn and interact with Indigenous cultures, an opportunity to do that. The one clarification I would make on your vision would be not on a reserve, but out on the land. And so I think what we need is people to experience the land as part of an Indigenous culture. And paradoxically, there are many Indigenous people who need to experience that as well, because the reserve existence and the way that it has become their lives prevents even them from experiencing their own culture on their land. And so a recommendation building on yours, as I would kind of restate it a little bit, would be Canadians and Indigenous youth should be supported in their effort of representing themselves to learn the value of the land and the waters to the sustenance of human life and health and wellness in this country. So if you draft that up, I'll sign it. Maybe the ambassador, maybe the high commissioner would even sign that.
Manvita, I think in the interest of time, we need to end with your question.
Thank you. I think my question has 2 parts, and you're welcome to address it as you like. The first part sort of addresses your experience in politics and has a practical aspect to it, recognizing that Canada is a settler society, and recognizing that it is also an immigrant society. There are those of us here who have not called Canada home for 12,000 years. There are those of us who haven't called Canada home for 400 years. There are those of us who have called it home for maybe 50, 60, 70 years. Keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind also global processes of colonization, what are the ways in which those of us who have called Canada home for 5, 10, 50 years, what does it mean to build solidarity with what you call resurgence, as opposed to pouring efforts into what the government of Canada calls reconciliation? Because that's a discourse that's easily accessible for several systemic reasons. But what does it mean to be able to make meaningful contributions to resurgence? Is there anything within your politics or your academic work in Canada or abroad that speaks to that?
Oh, thank you. Okay, thanks for that question. It's one that I faced quite a bit in my own thinking and trying to build a larger movement. And when we first started putting out ideas about resurgence, it was one of the first issues that we dealt with. And to answer it in a kind of a simple way, given the time, is that recognizing when people come to this country, either as refugees or immigrants or migrants and so forth, that they are coming into a colonial context is the first thing. And then people can be given the opportunity to follow responsibilities and a set of responsibilities based on their own personal commitments. We're not in a position to control immigration or to control the processes that govern a person's settlement here from another part of the world. But I think that we are in a position to educate, to influence, to engage, and so forth. And I think that if people who come to this country recognize the colonial nature of the relationship with Indigenous peoples, I think having that made clear, a lot of people would not want to replicate the injustices that they experience and that they are coming to get away from in other parts of the world. And I think that that's one of the central tasks of the Canadian government, is to keep people blind to that reality. So, when I was at the UN working a couple of times on these issues at the UNDRIP and so forth, meeting with representatives of the Canadian government over there, some of whom are Native themselves, saying, what are you complaining about? People in parts of the world are suffering far more than you guys. Why would you want to make Canada look like a bad place? Besides that, compare Indigenous rights in Canada to Indigenous rights in Guatemala or something like that, and look how far we've come. And they have a whole promotion machine around that. I didn't use the word propaganda, but could be seen as propaganda by people. But there's a whole image construction of what Canada is: peacemaker society, the apex of liberal progressivism, and so forth. And people come to Canada and are drawn because of that. If you complicate that picture, I think that really goes against the interests of Canada as the Canadian government sees it. And so therefore it does a lot of work to control the image in Canada, even to the point now of co-opting Indigenous activism and using Indigenous people to promote that. As I mentioned, was my experience. The idea of resurgence, though, is very powerful, because and this gets back to actually a point that I was going to make when I answered your question too, which is that if people are personally transformed, like we talked about, and have this personal strength, and are able to embody their indigeneity, it won't matter where they are. They'll be able to do that. I use the example of Kent Monkman. People may know the work of Kent Monkman. Brilliant work, very challenging, very pointed critique of colonization. He was recently featured at the Canadian High Commission in London, Canada House, and also in Paris, at the Canadian Embassy in Paris, and so forth. And so the idea of his beautiful work, for art's sake, is representative of the best work being done in Canada by an Indigenous person Canada wants to promote. But the substance of his work and his interactions with people clearly bring forward a critique. And I think that that's an example of the kind of thing that people can be doing to show that Canada is a complicated place, not a place that has all of its problems resolved in regard to Indigenous people. We would like to have Canada and Canadian governments respect more our rights to govern our own territory, which means engaging more with new migrants to this country. That's not happening yet, and I think that's a more practical kind of governmental type of reaction, which is to say Canada could respect the nationhood of the Indigenous people in these territories and bring in people and allow them to engage on the citizenship process in terms of education and the history, and possibly following in on the suggestions of the gentleman there, and allowing people to experience indigeneity, so that when they go and take their responsibilities up as citizens, they do it from a position of knowledge as opposed to a position of blindness to the realities of what's happened in this country.
Well, thank you so much. Many have long known of his eloquence as an orator, and not just as an orator, but as a responder to, I think in a very heartfelt way to your questions. There is chai, and I think he's more than happy to chat directly with people over chai. So.